Good morning or afternoon everyone, depending when you're watching this video. I prepared a new presentation for document 3, which you have to study this week. And I will get started, as the old story goes, with the title, which contains the main elements of the text. This is something I have already explained in the past. So in this on this first slide, you may see US-style rented housing goes global as millennials flock to cities. Several terms are interesting to study in this title. US-style rented housing. US-style rented housing is a phenomenon in the US where many people, due to the unaffordability, or you could say how unaffordable property is and having your own house is in the US, this phenomenon has led many people to start renting their properties. And this is something that has been going on for years in the US. And according to this article, which is going global at the moment, which is becoming international, it's an international phenomenon. More and more people, when they come and live in the city centers, cannot afford, they do not have the means to live in a city center and to buy property, purchase property in the city center. As a result, most of the time they have to rent their properties at quite a high cost sometimes. Now, this housing, this type of housing where you have to rent your property and which is becoming an international phenomenon, is also due to the fact that millennials flock to cities. Millennials is an interesting term. I don't know if you've ever heard about this term before. It concerns a very, I won't say popular, but at least a generation that is very talked about, which is Generation Y. Mostly people, and this is like really broadly, right, the people who were born between 1980 and 2000, right? So people who became adults at the turn of the new millennial, that's why we call them millennials, right? That makes sense. Now they flock to cities. Flock is a term we use for birds, so it's not derogatory towards millennials, but flocking to a place means congregating or gathering, is another one, or crowding, to crowd in a place, or herding, which is another term we use for animals. Okay. Herding, usually cows, you get them all together in the same place. So this younger generation appreciates living in cities. Therefore, there are more and more of these young generation people coming to cities. And due to the lack of property and how expensive property is as a result of this lack of property, therefore they start renting housing more and more. Another point of focus for us as you get started with this article is the source, because as I mentioned in the latest article you studied, which was more promotional, this one is important to have a look at. It will give you the tone and the style of the article. It will anticipate the tone. This is the FT, or Financial Times, which is a British newspaper which is mainly oriented towards economic journalism and business news. So you already know that very, very possibly the vocabulary will be more economic oriented. The jargon might be a bit more difficult for you to grasp. So if you struggle with this article, no worries, it is very understandable. Maybe business news is not the kind of news that you are used to reading. Right. The header is the next stage in reading the article, so let's go through this. Individual investors with small portfolios are being supplanted as landlords by global companies. The subject of this sentence, individual investors with small portfolios. A portfolio is an investment. It's a range of investment. So small investors, people with money who used to buy one property, maybe one flat or one house, and then rent it out, have been, or are being rather, because the verb tense is a continuous present, so this is a process that is ongoing at the moment, they have been supplanted. And this is a verb we have already come across in the latest article we studied together. To supplant is to overtake, so they are being overtaken. That's another verb you might want to use. Or they have been replaced, very simple one you might want to remember because I think it's closer to the French. Or it has been superseded. That's another one we never think about too much, but superseded is a nice one. It has been overthrown, a bit more violent as a term. It's been chucked away. It's been overthrown. As landlords. So if you remember the vocabulary we studied together, if you do not own a house but pay a monthly payment for renting your property, you are a tenant, right? And what you pay is rent. Whom do you pay this rent to? To a landlord or a landlady if the owner of the property who receives your rent is a woman. So those individual landlords, as you may have yourself if you are renting in Le Mans, have been replaced by global companies. So in a word, if I try to transform this or turn this into an equation, that's what it would look like, right? So global companies have replaced or are replacing individual investors. So now when people rent, they tend to rent property that belongs to major corporations, not to a single man or single woman who acts as landlord or landlady. Right. What I did this time, instead of reading the entire thing through, which is very tedious and very exhausting for you to listen to, I decided to focus on specific parts of the text. And not only did I do this, but also I divided this text in 3 sections. Right, which I will not name straight away, but I expect you to, as you go along, understand how we will end up understanding which section stands for what. The first section from line 5 to 22, the second from line 23 down to line 40, and the last section from line 41 down to 67. I strongly recommend, if you do have the text next to you, which you should have in your leaflet, to delineate the section that is concerned, right? So you know what we're working in particular. So in the first section, I simply picked the elements that to me I considered at least as being significant or important. So I will read those few sentences. So as you can see, this represents very few lines in the text. I basically skim read. To skim read means that you are reading on the surface the text and you extract the main elements. This is usually a form of reading we use to save time, so that might be something you want to develop, especially during exams. So let's focus on the first section. So first, the shift has been fueled by populations moving into cities. The shift they're referring to in this section is the change from private landlords, individual landlords anyway, because the companies are private as well. So the shift is the change from individual landlords or landladies to global companies renting the places. And this change is explained by the number of people who are moving into cities. As I told you, especially younger generations prefer living in city centres rather than in the countryside. And this is a global phenomenon. More and more people are flocking to cities. They are gathering in cities because it concentrates all the services they need, right, for their daily life. Now, next paragraph. In the US, the rate of urban population growth outpaced. To outpace something means to overtake. Once again, it means becoming more important than. So it outpaced the suburbs in 2011, which means more and more people are moving to the city centres rather than the suburbs, so on the outskirts of the city. They want to be within the city. So it outpaced the suburbs in 2011 for the first time in nearly a century. This has pushed up house prices to the point where they are unaffordable for many, creating ballooning demand for rented homes. This is something we discussed when we talked about gentrification. The more people in a city, the less property is available. And if you do not have much supply of something, you have more demand than supply. You want something more than there is a quantity of that something you want, then the price is going up. So the reason why the property is becoming so expensive in city centres is because there is this movement of many people wanting to live in city centres. The more people in city centres, the more expensive, basically, right? So the more, you heard that one. Next, professional investors are hunting for assets. Assets is usually a byword for profits, for assets that can generate steady incomes over many decades. So the first reason, you can see here, for the change that is happening in the rental market is due to how many people are moving to those city centres. Now, the second reason for this happening, why do big companies invest in the rental market, is due to professional investors, so those people working in those major corporations, those major companies who buy houses, turn them into flats or houses that they rent out to people, is because they want to generate incomes, basically make money. They want to make money by investing, and they explain this. Germany privatized much of its municipal housing in the 2000s. It means that the private sector, especially as I mentioned, major substantial companies, buy in bulk. When you buy in bulk, it means you buy many or huge quantity of something at the same time. So they buy derelict maybe or rundown places, such as we've seen with gentrification. They privatize it, they turn it into a major development, and then they can generate profits by cutting, or not cutting out, but dividing the property into many different flats, for example. And it obviously generate more profits. The more flats, the more money, okay? The more rents you get every month. So you buy a property, you renovate this property, and then you divide this property in many flats so that you get many rents every month, and it generates a profit. So we may see here a first reason is many people move to city. And the second reason for big companies gaining momentum is, well, they have an opportunity to generate a profit by renting out property. Right. When we look at the second section now, I'm going to try to speed up a little bit. The second section focuses on the type of development that this paves the way for. Because you can imagine that if you want to pack as many people as possible in the same spot, in the same place, you will have to divide those properties into smaller places for people to live, and you will possibly want to place as many people in those places as possible. Place, there's a lot of place. You want to offer or to provide as many flats as possible in those buildings. As I said, the more flats, the more rents. The more rents, the more profits. So the development, look at this sentence, the development where Julia is the woman mentioned at the very beginning of the article, she's a millennial, the development where Julia lives, which will eventually contain 5,000 homes for rent. I just picked up this sentence. It's not a real sentence, there's a part missing, but what matters to me is this. 5,000 homes for rent. So you do have 5,000 people living in the same place, in the same development. A development is like a complex of buildings. You may understand right now that these are places where there is a form of concentration of people in the city centres. And this is the result of these new forms of rental properties, is that, and very unfortunately, they do not offer the opportunity to give people space, but it's packing people in city centres and just renting out those places. Now, another sentence I picked was, a demand for land and blocks of flat has risen so much. As a result of these many people that you have to place in the same spot, blocks of flats are emerging. Blocks of flats are also known as high rises. Oops, I'm gonna have to change this. High rises, which are those blocks of flats, those very high buildings in which you top people on top of one another, right? You accommodate many people in the same building, usually a very high building. You see what I'm referring to. The next element I selected is Greystar, the largest apartment operator in the US, is rapidly expanding its international operations. Interestingly enough, this phenomenon started in the US, but the companies which operate those investments, those rentals in the city, are trying to gain more markets internationally. So not only do they invest in US cities, but they also start buying property in major big cities outside in the world. And I'm thinking Paris, London, Madrid, Rome, and they are the same companies. So those companies are huge and colossal. They own many properties all over the world that they rent to people. And every month they get all the rents from all these people, which generate, as you can imagine, absolutely substantial amounts of money. Last element I chose for this section is private equity groups, so other investors seeking private equity type returns. The term private equity is basically a form of investment with a bit of risk taking. So you're investing in something, and well, basically it's an investment. Okay, if I try to simplify this, I am definitely not an economist. So those groups often feature heavily among the early purchasers and developers. So they are the first people who buy and develop flats and blocks of flats and high rises. They rush in the cities to make sure they can get hold of cheap property. And what do they do then? And this resonates a lot with gentrification. They aim for rapid capital uplift as they develop or renovate properties. So they rehabilitate those buildings. And then what they want is rapid capital uplift, which means basically very quick returns on investment. So they buy cheap derelict property, rehabilitate it quickly, and then rent those places. And that's a very solid, fast way of making money. So this section seems to develop more the consequences, which I can count. I think there are two. If I really focus on this, if I look at this section, I focus on this. If I look at this section, first is the consequence on the type of property that is offered, high rises. So that's the first consequence, and then the second consequence is the expansion of this form of investment all over the world, and this form of regeneration, and obviously profits. that are entailed by this regeneration and in investment. The last section, down to the end of the text, is I think is developing it's developing various reactions. And as is very usual in articles, you are very likely, even before we get started, you may already anticipate this, we are likely to hear from people who disagree with this form of development, and people who adhere to something is to support it. Okay, to agree with it, to see eye to eye with it. So some people adhere, some people oppose it. Okay. This is a very common feature in many articles. If you are offered reactions, if you are given to read reactions from the people who are impacted by this shift, most of the time it will be a polarized view, so that you may be given a balanced view of how people reacted. Let's have a look at this first sentence I introduced in this section. So I quoted from this section. The early phase of privatized housing was characterized by tenant protests as companies underinvested in the properties. Negative terms, so starting with people who oppose it, at first tenant protested, which means they were quite unhappy with these new forms of development. They thought the properties were being underinvested in. As you can imagine, once again, those investors are buying cheap properties, renting them out very fast to make a profit. Their aim, their goal is to make money. So they do not spend a lot of time thinking about the infrastructure, or how to improve the amenities, or how to offer more space to people, or how to use quality product. They are trying to do it on the cheap. The point of these companies, the point of any company, is to generate profits, is to make money. So to make money, you buy the cheapest quality product, or at least maybe not all of them are doing this, but you would go on the lower spectrum of investment. So you would go for cheaper material. And that's why people were very dissatisfied, because they thought that the quality of their property was impacted by this constant urge to make money. More serious than the quality of product is this. In the US, corporate landlords, especially those from the private equity sector, had high eviction rates. So what happened is many people were being turned out from these properties if they didn't have the money, for instance, if they were low-income families, if they couldn't keep up with the rent. So the turnover is an economic term we use when there are people replacing people all the time. It's a cycle, right? One person taking over another, and so on and so forth. It's called a turnover. The turnover was high because many people were turned out or evicted from those places. So very negative comments on this new form of property rental. And yet, and you can see this however popping up, however, the UK's new corporate landlords are keen to impress tenants, if only so that they can boast of low tenant turnover when they sell on their assets. So, as a result of all these criticisms levelled at them, property investors and what they call corporate landlords, it's an interesting term. It means those big companies acting as landlords, right? It's not individual people, but it's those major corporations are trying to restore their image. They're trying to change their image by making sure the turnover is low, because it doesn't give a really nice impression. The reputation of a building in which people keep being replaced and there are many places to rent is not usually a very attractive one. So they're trying to lower, or like at least restore this image and lower the number of people leaving, coming, right? They're trying to offer the image of a steady place of accommodation. Now, I've continued this section because it was quite long. So as you could see, this section, the first part focused on the people who opposed this new development. Now, in the In the last part of this section, we will be given to see the people who are supporting this project, or at least who are not reluctant, they are not balking at. To balk at something is refuse to do some things, and they are not balking at these new forms of property. Read the first paragraph. 21% were renting because it enables them to live in a more expensive area than those where they could afford to buy, while 8% did not want the responsibility of owning a home and 5% valued being able to move easily. You are given here the reasons why people decide to rent over owning their houses. Usually, the ultimate goal of people in their lives is to possess, to own their own property, right? It's supposed to be a sign, a marker of success. You have your own house, your own home. Nothing can happen to you because you have your own place and it belongs to you. And yet, as we can see in this paragraph, you are given the reasons why people prefer renting, which is quite unusual, and it goes against the grain, pretty much. And the reasons is that some people cannot afford to buy property, so they just rent because they want to live in really cool and attractive places, but they do not have the money to do so. So they prefer renting, and at least it gives them the opportunity to enjoy the places where they wish they could live. And at the same time, they don't have to buy it, because if they had to purchase those places, they couldn't, right? They wouldn't have the means to do so. Now, the second reason is that some people find that it's too much responsibility. Having a house, you have to pay taxes, you have to upkeep or maintain your building, your house, your flat, you have to invest, you have to make sure it's running correctly and properly. So it's a lot of responsibility, especially for young people. The last reason is that when you rent, you can easily move. You pack and go, right? If you own a house, you have to first sell it. There's a long process. If suddenly you have to move because you want to change jobs, or because, well, you just want to move somewhere else, people are very mobile today, then you can move easily if you rent. Right? So some people are, well, quite like the idea of renting rather than owning due to these reasons. Second line I selected, at the extreme end of this lifestyle shift are upmarket co-living development. So this is the other end of the spectrum. You do get people who really want to live together. It's called co-living development. So you go from this idea of the high rise where everybody's packed, right? They're like sardines, to these ideas of development in which you get many people, but you live together in a spirit of shared community, which is mentioned here. Everything is handled centrally, and it starts here. And the social life, I could have completed. The social life is bolstered, is reinforced, is enhanced. It fosters a sense of community. You share spaces in the development. Your children might play outside together in the amenities that have been fitted for them to use. So it might be a nice feeling that you all live in the same place and you can socialize and share some of your life with your neighbors. So it's an interesting development, especially among millennials. Do not forget that this article focused on this younger generation of people. They tend to enjoy this socializing, which is surprising when you think about the growing that's going to be difficult to say, individualization, like how individualistic people are becoming. If you struggle, find the adjective, you'll be fine. Right, so now it's time for synthesis. You have studied, or at least I have, and you have listened. I have studied each section, and this is what it looks like, right? So this first section offers the reasons why this new rental phenomenon, by this rental development by big corporations is occurring. Second section is giving you the consequences. So on the one hand, the type of property that is being developed, where you you pack people in, and also like this international movement where the rental sector, the housing sector is being privatized. Do not forget that today in major cities, it is not the local authorities which are offering property to people. When people need social housing, they have to address private companies. If you are a low-income household or family, you have to go and find a private company renting out property to you. It's not the city providing social housing anymore, it's private companies. And the last section concerns the reactions of people. On the one hand, rather negative reactions, on the other, positive reactions. Right. So I'm trying to make it as clear as possible for you to see how the text is structured. Now, I gave title to each section so that you might understand how the text is organized. When you start presenting this text, do remember that you always start in the introduction with a sentence that encapsulates, that already tells the examiner or the person listening to you in which direction the text is going. So you might say, this article first focuses on the reasons for global privatization of cities before stressing the consequence both on property development and investors, and finally emphasizing the reactions from tenants, or observing the reactions from tenants. So once you have given or slapped a title on each section, all you need is one sentence in which you introduce those three elements, so that we know before we get started which three sections which section we will be going through as we go along. Right? It gives a direction once again. It's a route, as if you were starting a journey in your presentation. First stop will be this one, second this one, and last this one. Now, the next stage and penultimate stage is the one before last. When you read a text, the idea is that you rephrase the text, and this is something we do all the time in class. You should be able to do so, but in order to do so, you do need vocabulary, obviously. If you want to replace one word with another, that requires for you to know quite an extensive range of vocabulary. For example, so I gave you an example with this first section. The shift has been fueled by populations moving into cities. I rephrased this with the substitution of individual landlords, sorry for the typo, landlords, by global companies. So this is a replacement for shift. Has been caused, so fueled by, I said, has been caused by a growing urban attractivity. That's how I explained the idea that populations were moving into cities. It means they are attracted by, they're pulled in cities because cities are attractive. So I said they're caused by growing urban attractivity. Right. Obviously, this sounds very formal. We are far from the original sentence, but I reused the main elements, so shift to be fueled by, and this sentence, and I replaced it by my own words. Same thing with the next paragraph. So I replaced the paragraph right straight away. So in the US, remember, the rate of urban population growth outpaced the suburbs. This has pushed up house prices, and now they're unaffordable property, and it created ballooning demand. Ballooning means increasing demand. I replaced this paragraph with this one. As an increasing number of city dwellers settle in urban centres, it ends up inflating. See, we talked about the ballooning. Ballooning, inflating, same thing. So inflating the cost of property, therefore forcing people to turn to the rental market. All this paragraph has been replaced by my own words. The next one is professional investors are hunting for assets that can generate steady incomes over many decades. So I talked about global investors. You could say corporate investors. That's the word that was used. That's an interesting one. Corporate investors are looking for assets. I said means of generating reliable profits. So assets is profits that can generate steady incomes over many decades. I cheated a bit because I used the word generating again. You could say producing, but we don't produce profit as well. We really generate profits. So profits are brought I think it would be, you would say brought along or brought on rather. Brought about is another one. Bring about something is something you could use if you want to replace generate. I strongly advise you to work with a thesaurus. I don't know if you've ever heard about this term. Thesaurus, you do have many applications or websites. You do not have to invest in the book because you don't buy books anyway, so you can consult and read and look up a thesaurus, which is basically a dictionary of synonyms. So you type generating. What I do most of the time when I need a synonym, I Google the word. So I would say generate, would write it down, type it up, generate synonym, and then I will be given synonyms. Now, obviously, the hardest part of this is selecting the right words because a word might have different meanings, so you need to make sure you select the right one. It seems simple to say, but many students get confused, especially when it's not your own language, right? It's difficult to understand the nuances. So anyway, back to this. So this paragraph I transformed with this. So they are looking for means of generating reliable and sustainable profits in the future. So I basically reformulated this with words that have exactly the same meaning. If you have time to do so, you might have time. There is an episode, I know you probably think that I'm very uncool mentioning this, in Friends, in which Joey has to write a letter and he wants to sound really... is it a letter? Yeah, he has to write a letter of recommendation for his friends and he wants to sound very... how shall I say, very formal in the letter. And what he does, he replaces all the words by other words, but they get all wrong. And it's a funny one, just to show the extreme version of what we're doing here. Maybe I'll send you the link if you're interested, because it's a fun scene to watch. Right. So once you have reformulated each of those parts, your job is not done. Far from it, because you will not go through all the paragraphs and all the lines and rephrase all of them, because that will take you as long as the text itself. And most of what you have to do is, well, most of the time you have to deliver a synthesis. You have to sum up the ideas somehow. So the next stage, once you have replaced all the paragraphs, and I've replaced also the last one about Germany. I said a universal movement towards privatization of city housing is gaining momentum. Once you have replaced or rephrased all the words from the text, now it's time to synthesize them. So you will reuse each point and combine them into sentences on this last version. That will be the version you will offer to the person listening to you. So the reasons for the substitution, and see, I'm indicating from the start what I'm talking about is the title of my section. I'm talking about the reason. So I start with this so that we know what I'm talking about. The reasons for this the substitution of individual landlords by global companies are twofold. Remember, I explained this before. It means there are two. Not only an old friend of ours, you must be fed up with this advanced structure, but it's very useful because there are two, well, you know what to do with this. Not only are urban centres increasingly attracting the new generations, thus, therefore, in consequence, making it unaffordable to afford purchasing a house in city centres, but it also enables global professional investors to generate colossal profits in the rental housing market. As a result, the importance of link words, I will never stress this enough, the universal privatization of housing in megalopolises is gaining momentum. There you go. You have summed up everything that was here. You reused some of the terms you had used in your rephrasing, and you get the main ideas, and that's how you synthesize. So I hope you understand the process. It takes time. That's why you have to get used to this. You have to break yourself into the habit of doing this, because for the written exam, you are only given 3 hours, during which you have to read the text, then you have to process the text the way I've done earlier in this presentation, and then you have to reach this final stage, which will be the written part on your paper. This is a long process to get to this stage. I did the same with the next section, so I will not go through the reformulations and the rephrasing. You can have a look at this. But the final result is this. This change in housing development led some tenants, without the A, typo, led some tenants to move in multi-complex property developments as the urge for estate and high-rises has been on the rise. So I'm explaining there are more and more high-rises because the number of tenants is growing. It also drives private, oh my god, so many typos, private investors to chase other markets internationally to reproduce these schemes. I correct myself as I go along because I typed this very quickly this morning. In all major cities, they subsequently succeed in optimizing their investment and turn these schemes into long-lasting profits. See, the idea that they would make profit in the future, where that was this, they would, that was the previous one. I'm going to go back to this. They want to rapid uplift and they want to make sure that they can get money in the future. Right? This idea is represented by long-lasting profits. And I used heavily those link words that help structuring the text. So sometimes you can use very easy ones, such as, which offers an explanation, or also add something. Sometimes it's an adverb, okay, that can help. Subsequently, which means then, okay, so as a result of then, subsequently, you're sorted with this adverb. It works. I've got 3 in one paragraph, okay, 3 link words in the same paragraph, which means you need a lot of those link words to structure what you have to say. The last section, sorry, I like the choice of the color for the font was really not clever at all, because white on a green background is not the best, but I apologize for this. So now I will discuss the reactions of tenants. So what I did here, I did not even rephrase, I jumped straight to my paragraph. So though, use link word to get started. So though the first reactions from tenants were hostile, the latter referring to, you have a direct reference to this word. So the tenants, basically, so I don't want to repeat tenants. The latter blaming private investors for neglecting their buildings in order to make a maximum amount of money, along with, so I want to add 2 ideas. They blame the investors for 2 reasons. The first one is here, neglecting the buildings. The second is this. So I introduced the second one saying, along with turning out tenants. So I go back to my sentence. Though the first reactions were hostile, okay, if I make it shorter, the private housing companies tried to limit residency turnover, which tarnishes their image and restore their image. Oh, that doesn't go. Which tarnishes their image. Oh, you would have to stop here and not add this. It doesn't restore the image. Okay. So you have, otherwise it doesn't make sense at all. So see, that's interesting because you could see the process which I'm following myself when I'm writing. I need to edit my own work, and this is something you have to do along as you go through your work. At the other end of the spectrum, so that's an interesting term you could use. You want to say, on the one hand, sometimes you want to say that basically there are people who are against, there are people who are for these new forms of developments. Now, if you want to say on the one hand, on the other hand, you might say at the one end of the spectrum, at the other end of the spectrum. And that's a different word for you to use. At the other end of the spectrum has developed an alternative lifestyle, particularly among the millennials. Do not forget that was the object of the text. Indeed, many value renting over owning their houses, and they even appreciate sharing the living space with other tenants, which bolsters socializing and community life. So I hope that this video has really helped you see how we build up a synthesis from the text, like the raw resource you are given, which is this article, into a synthesis. Because at the end of the day, what you will write on your paper is basically this first paragraph, this second paragraph, and this third paragraph, and that's it. This will be the final outcome of all you've done before. And because the examiner doesn't know what you've done before, it needs to show and transpire and permeate the final work you write on the page. But you cannot do this if you jump straight onto your paper without reflecting first on all the various stages that I have already explained in this video. Right,